In this session, we will have a brief introduction about memory, the purpose of memory, the memory hierarchy or different types of memory, and how memory finds its usage with respect to computers. This is going to be only an introductory session where we'll be introduced about memory and its types. First of all, we know a memory is basically a storage. For example, we have a human brain. The brain can store information and we are able to recall that information at any point of time. It is stored permanently in memory, depending on whether the content is stored in long-term memory or short-term memory. What is a long-term memory? The content goes permanently into your brain, into our memory capacity, and we are able to recall that at any point of time. For example, it could be your school prayer song, or it could be a song of your choice, or it could be some piece of information which is your mobile number or somebody's kith and kin's number that gets permanently stored. You are able to recall at any point of time, maybe even after years. On the other hand, the human brain do have short-term memory where we store contents there only for a temporary period or for a short period. For example, we prepare for the examination, and after the exams are over, or when we move on to the next semester, we may tend to forget what we have learned in the previous semester. And that is what we call them as the short-term memory. So therefore, our memory can store things either for a long-term basis or for a short-term basis. So that's what I meant as permanent and let me say temporary, for a temporary period or for a longer period. So I could put that way. Likewise, the purpose of any memory storage is to store. Store what? Store information. When we have computer, we all know computer is meant for processing. So before processing actually takes place in a computer, we have to have a place or a folder where we have to store our program and the data. You know what is a program? A program is a sequence of instructions written by the user to solve a specific problem. For example, you'll be learning about C programming or other programming languages either at the +2 level or you might be doing currently now. A program is a sequence of instructions. For example, you have a C program. When you are executing the program, you require the data. The data has to be stored and you are going to manipulate data using your program. So therefore, program and data, they coexist together. And before processing done by the CPU, they have to be stored. Where are they stored? So that is the purpose of storage. And when you come to storage, they are of two types. One is a permanent storage, that is called as a non-volatile storage or non-volatile memory. And the second one is referred as the volatile storage or temporary memory. So permanent storage, temporary storage, or permanent memory, temporary memory. Permanent memory is called as non-volatile and the temporary memory is called volatile memory. When we come to computer, we have got two different types. One is called primary storage. The other one is called secondary storage. The primary storage is also known as volatile storage or temporary storage. And the secondary storage is referred as a non-volatile storage or permanent storage. Therefore, I can put this way. When you come to computer, we have got two different types of memory. Kindly recall, the purpose of memory is to store. Store what? Data. Data in terms of binary form. You know what is a binary? Bi means 2. There are only two different digits, 0 and 1. So we are going to store information, everything only in binary form. It could be information or it could be data. It could be datum. Please remember, data is plural and datum is singular. So we are going to store the data to be processed in memory. We also do store the program to process the data also in memory. Initially, where are they stored? Your program and data, initially they will be stored only on the secondary storage. So which is your secondary storage? For example, we have our hard disk. A hard disk is an example of a secondary storage. Sometimes you can store your program and data in your, for example, pen drive. That is also a secondary storage. The data stored in your hard disk or your pen drive or USB drive, it is stored permanently. Even when the computer is switched off, the content permanently remains. It is available. On the other hand, when you come to your temporary storage or a volatile storage, the content will be there on the storage as long as power remains. When there is no power, the content goes off. And that is what we call them as your temporary memory or volatile memory. It is also referred as primary memory. So don't get confused. Temporary memory, primary memory, and volatile memory, all the three are synonyms. You can call it as a volatile storage or temporary storage or primary storage. So why we have a why do we have a primary storage? Why can't we process everything using a secondary storage? A question may arise. Probably we can discuss it a bit later about that. So keep in mind, a secondary storage is used for storing your program and data permanently. Examples are your pen drive and your hard disk. The hard disk is, it could be either external hard disk or let me say a hard disk which could be connected to USB drive, which could be removed from the system. So I can put this way, a hard disk can be either sealed permanently inside your laptop or inside your desktop system, or it is a removable hard disk. Right? So we have a removable hard disk, which is currently available. Either one of them can be made use of depending on your requirement. And the capacity of your hard disk, it goes in terms of gigabytes or in terms of terabytes. So depending on whether it is a bulky storage or whether it is going to be a pen drive. Pen drive gives you in terms of GB. You can have a pen drive of 4 GB or 8 GB or 16 GB. GB, it stands for gigabyte. Whereas when I come to hard disk, its capacity starts in terms of TB, terabyte. So 1024 GB is equal to 1 terabyte. We go in for a hard disk of capacity of 1 TB or 2 terabytes or 4 terabytes and so on and so forth. As I said earlier, it could be either external hard disk or internal hard disk. Internal hard disk means it's inside your system, which is not visible to the end user, and the end user cannot connect and then disconnect. It's not a plug and play device. It is permanently sealed inside the computer. On the other hand, the external hard disk is one which could be removed, it could be plugged in and as well as plugged out by the user as and when they want, depending on the usage. So secondary storage is permanent. Keep that in mind. Then let me come to the next point. So we store our program and data on secondary storage. They have to be executed. Where it gets executed, your C program gets executed only on your CPU, central processing unit. That's your processor. Therefore, for execution purpose, you transfer your program and data from secondary storage to your primary storage. And that primary storage, kindly keep in mind, it's a volatile storage, it's a temporary storage. Temporary means as long as your power is on in your computer system, it works. When you shut down your computer system, the content of your primary storage completely vanishes. It goes off immediately. Example of primary storage, of course, we heard the terminology known as RAM. RAM. It stands for random access memory. So random access memory is a volatile storage, whereas your hard disk is a non-volatile storage. So RAM is an example of your primary storage, and hard disk and your pen drive are examples of secondary storage. And how do they differ? They differ in terms of their capacity, differ in terms of their technology, differ in terms of their pricing factor. For example, if you take a primary memory, the primary memory capacity or your RAM capacity is going to be only in GB. GB stands for gigabyte. So 1 gigabyte is equal to 1024 kilobytes. If you consider your laptop or a desktop, generally we say, I have a laptop or I have a desktop system whose memory capacity is 2 GB or 4 GB RAM. 4 GB RAM means 4 gigabytes random access memory. And your program and data, which is stored in your hard disk, is transferred to your primary memory in terms of whose capacity is in terms of GBs, and then it gets executed by the processor. After processing is done, what we do, we transfer our results or the output back to your secondary storage. Therefore, when we come to processing, please do remember it has got 3 important elements: input, process, and output. So supply your inputs, process your inputs based on your program or instructions, and after processing is done by the CPU, you get your resulting values as output, and this output value has to be permanently stored again back onto the secondary storage. So this is the basic idea behind the processing. So this is about your memory. So once you talk about memory, Memory is meant for storing. There are two different types of memory. Kindly keep in mind. One is a primary memory and the other one is a secondary memory. Primary memory is volatile and secondary memory is non-volatile. Primary memory is also known as temporary memory. Secondary memory is also known as permanent memory. The important differentiating factors are primary memory is in terms of GB, gigabytes. Secondary memory is in terms of terabytes. Primary memory is inside the computer and secondary memory can be either external or what? Internal. And most importantly, primary memory is faster in speed and your secondary memory is very, very slow in speed. How do you measure the speed of your memory? It is done in terms of, let me say, milliseconds or microseconds or nanoseconds. You know what is a millisecond? 1/1000th of a second is called a millisecond. 1/1000th of a millisecond is called a microsecond. 1/1000th of a microsecond is called a nanosecond. So 1/1000 second is equivalent to milli 10⁻³ seconds. 1/1000 of a millisecond is known as microsecond, that is 10⁻⁻6. 10⁻⁻6 second is equivalent to 1 microsecond. 10⁻⁻9 second is equivalent to 1 nanosecond. Therefore, I can put this way that if the important differences between your primary memory and secondary memory are primary memory has got limited storage capacity in terms of GB. Secondary memory has got very huge storage capacity in terms of TB. The cost of storing in the case of primary memory is higher. The cost of storing a bit in the case of secondary memory is very cheaper. And primary memory is very faster in speed. Its speed is in terms of nanoseconds, whereas your secondary memory is very, very slow. Whose speed or its speed is in terms of milliseconds. And more importantly, primary memory is volatile and secondary memory is non-volatile. So these are the basic differences between your primary memory and secondary memory or permanent memory. And most important, one more important difference I could easily tell you now is that primary memory can be directly accessed by the CPU. CPU means central processing unit or your processor. The CPU can directly access your primary memory or RAM, whereas your CPU cannot directly access your secondary memory or a permanent memory, for example, disk. So what we do, first of all, for processing, since the memory is not directly connected, which memory? Secondary memory is not directly connected with CPU. Our first primary job is to transfer your program and data from secondary memory to primary memory. And then since primary memory is having a contact with CPU, they can handshake with each other, they can interact with each other. Therefore, the requirement is transfer your data and program from secondary storage to primary storage, process it. Once processing is done, transfer your results back to your secondary memory. So this is about your memory. Primary memory, there are, once you talk about primary memory, I said it is known as a RAM, random access memory. And there are two different types of RAM. Generally, it is known as a static RAM and then what? Dynamic RAM. We will see in the next session about the salient features of static RAM and dynamic RAM. Within dynamic RAM, again, there are two types. One is synchronous dynamic RAM. Another one is known as rhombus dynamic RAM, that is SD RAM, and then RD RAM, rhombus dynamic RAM. And one more type of memory, which is also part of your primary storage, is also known as a ROM, ROM. It is called read-only memory. Read-only memory, as the name suggests, you can only read its contents. You cannot write anything. That means its contents are already written by the manufacturer. Who manufactures memory chips? For example, it's basically an integrated circuit, IC, generally we call, and the programs are permanently stored in the case of a ROM by the person who manufactures it or who is responsible for producing it. So the production department of the company takes care of storing the code or data, whatever you call, into ROM. That is why it is called as a read-only memory. It is also known as WORM, WORM, write once, read many times. So that is the salient feature of ROM. So therefore, once you come to primary, though we talk in essence about RAM, we do have a memory also known as ROM. Let us see the differences between RAM and ROM and the differences within RAM and within ROM in the next session. And of course, we do have other types of memories that I can pitch in a bit later. And one of its type is known as the cache memory. That is an interface between your primary memory and your CPU. So therefore, you can now analyze the hierarchy of memory. We have got secondary storage, We transfer our program and data from secondary storage to primary storage, and from primary storage, it goes to CPU for processing. With the help of your system bus, you can quickly recall, you would have known about address bus and data bus. Address bus is meant for transferring the address from CPU to the storage, and data bus is meant for transferring data in both ways. That means from memory to CPU and from CPU to memory. You can recall, you would have learned about IO processors or IO organization, where we have two different types of operations. One is called read, another one is called write. In the case of reading operation, the data is transferred from memory to CPU. It is also known as a fetching operation. And the opposite operation is known as storing operation. In the case of store or write operation, the data goes from CPU to memory. So remember, in the case of reading operation, your RAM is a sender and CPU is a receiver. In the case of storing operation or writing operation, CPU is a sender and your RAM is your receiver. So therefore, data is transferred between your CPU and memory. When I mean memory, kindly keep in mind, it's only with respect to RAM. Let us see about the introduction of cache memory bit later. Till such time, the data transfer takes place only between your CPU and your main memory. It is also called primary memory. It is also referred as your RAM. So keep in mind, whenever we give a lecture about main memory is also known as RAM. It is also known as primary memory. It is also known as temporary memory. It is also referred as volatile memory. So keep in mind the important differences. Quick recall: primary memory is temporary. That is volatile. It has got a storage capacity in terms of gigabytes. It is costly, and more importantly, whenever the computer is turned off, the content goes off. And this memory is directly connected with the CPU. When you come to secondary memory, its capacity is in terms of terabytes. Its cost is cheaper, relatively cheaper when compared with your primary storage. And most importantly, its speed is not is equivalent to your primary memory. Its speed is very slow in terms of milliseconds. Whereas in the case of primary memory, its speed is in terms of nanoseconds. And the last important point, the important difference is that it is not directly connected with your CPU. Secondary memory or your hard disk is not directly connected with your CPU. Only your primary memory is directly connected with your CPU. So therefore, whenever CPU has to fetch data from secondary memory, what we have to do, we have to transfer your data from secondary to primary, and then from primary to CPU, we can send it for processing. How do we do? With the help of a bus, and that is called as your address bus for sending the address of the location, and data bus is meant for sending and receiving the data. And we have got control bus through which we send control signals. What type of control signals? Control signals are used for performing your operations, like whether the memory is activated or whether the memory is active or inactive. And then using special control signals like read and write to perform reading operation or writing operation. And these are the important, let me say, concepts of your bus components or bus system features with respect to your system. In general, these three buses are referred as your system bus. What are they? Address bus, data bus, and control bus. So this marks the end of the introductory session. Kindly keep in mind, when you come to memory hierarchy, there are three different types of memory. Secondary memory is very slow, having huge capacity. Its processing speed is in terms of milliseconds. Primary memory, its capacity is less in terms of GB. It is faster than your secondary memory. Its speed is in terms of nanoseconds. And it is a temporary memory or a volatile memory. In between your primary memory and CPU, let us introduce one more memory that is called cache memory. That we'll see in the next session. Thank you.